Is there proof for the existence of God? Pastor Christopher Hilken over at North Coast Church would like you to think so, but yeah, he's got a profit motive just like most of them do. This is part 3 of a 5-part series, and so far, it's going absolutely nowhere. But maybe this time it will. Maybe. Just maybe. Yeah, don't hold your breath. It's been a long time since we looked back at North Coast Church's Evidence for God series, where they never seem to have any actual evidence for anything but their own absurdity. But yeah, here we go again. This time, Christopher Hilken tries to play make-believe with words spoken by a child, because that's really all any of these people are. Children. Out of the mouths of babes come absurdities the likes of which you've never seen. Or you probably have, because these people can never come up with anything new. Or valid. Mostly valid. So, yeah, here we go again.
Hey Daily Dosers, my name is Chris Hilken. Today we're on day 3 of Evidence for God's Existence. So today we talked the first day about why is there something rather than nothing. Yesterday we talked about because there is something rather than nothing, and that something had an original beginning, that something must have a cause or a causal agent that made it.
Well, you really just talked about the same thing as day number 1, which we pointed out in our refutation of your second video. It was really just a continuation of the first point and added nothing of substance to your argument. I'll add links to the first 2 previous videos in the description for people who want to go back and see what was said. But honestly, it wasn't remotely interesting or defensible, so I think you can safely skip them if you'd like. I'm just hoping that this time out, he actually has something new and intelligent to say. I'm not holding my breath, but maybe I might keep a couple of fingers crossed, just in case.
And if that causal agent is bigger than the universe, that's kind of what we all mean when we say the idea of God, but it also points to you and me.
No, it really doesn't. And this is really the point that needs to be made. See, you will find a lot of Christian apologists who say, this big thing over there that we can hypothesize, well, we just call that God. Except they don't. Their conception of God isn't the same as that thing over there. It's a very personal, emotionally satisfying being with a whole lot of specific characteristics that they've just randomly assigned because it makes them feel good. It's why all of these religious philosophical arguments can't get you anywhere useful. It might get them so far to suggest that something just might be out there. That's suggest, not prove, by the way. And then they take the concept of this vague something out there somewhere and then staple a bunch of other stuff to it for emotional reasons, which fundamentally change the whole idea they started with. It's pure bait and switch. It's like saying, we know that there are giant squid in the ocean, and then grafting other ideas onto giant squid until you've come up with claims of Cthulhu. If you are claiming God with all the bells and whistles, then you need to prove God with all the bells and whistles. Otherwise, it's just a big crustacean, and you haven't proven a damn thing.
That if we are contingent beings and everything that begins to exist has a purpose, you and I began to exist, which means we've got a purpose that we're supposed to be searching and looking for that's bigger than us, and it's grounded in who made us.
You notice he keeps going back to what he's done before, right? Now, one thing I want to point out is that all of these videos are the exact same length. 5 minutes and 5 seconds long to be exact. So all of this is just padding to get him to hit that precise time code. Now, I don't know what the significance of that might be, but I find it kind of hard to believe that he did 5 videos in a row that were all exactly the same length. Therefore, I had to assume there had to be some kind of meaning behind it, So I went and looked it up. And if you go and look at Christian numerology, 505 comes from the Jewish Kabbalah and has to do with guardian angels. Now, I have no idea if that's what was intended or not, but it would hardly surprise me if they were going for mirror hour symbolism. That's just a little bonus information for you. Anyway, back to the video.
Today we're talking about this idea of when we look around the universe, there seems to be complexity everywhere.
Seems to be. You notice that's always how it's stated. There seems to be. Okay, why? Why have you interpreted this as complexity? They will often throw around entropy as though you can't have this amazing complexity in any kind of entropic system. Except they don't understand what entropy actually says. Everything we see around us is actually a corruption of complexity. The most entropically well-ordered system possible came at the very moment of the Big Bang. The universe was uniformly hot and uniformly dense, and that is the most well-ordered conditions this universe will ever see. Everything since has been degradation. Things have been cooling off and spreading out until we will reach the heat death of the universe where everything is uniformly cold and uniformly spread out. What we see today isn't order. It's only interpreted that way by running it through their particular emotional religious filter. These people don't know what the hell they're talking about. I trust no one is surprised.
And the argument is really simple. I was up at Hume Lake with my son a couple summers back, and we were walking up this trail, and someone had carved their initials into a tree with a heart around it. And that level of complexity, my son Peyton said, who drew that? And now you might say, well, you brainwashed your kid to see design, to see patterns everywhere. But my son, who was 4 years old at the time, looked at something as simple as a carved heart and 2 letters and said, who was here?
Because we know from personal experience that things like that are done by individuals. We have experience with those things. So when we see an identifiable pattern carved into a tree, we understand that's what happened. But the religious then go on to make assumptions about the universe itself. They use things like the watchmaker argument, which essentially goes like this. If you're walking along a beach and you find a watch, you would know that that watch was made, not just appeared fully formed from nature. But that's only because we know that watches are made. We know there are factories and craftsmen out there who make them. However, we have no experience with a constructed universe. You can't just say, yes, this was built by someone, because you've got no experience to prove that is the case. We have no rational means of making that determination. However, the religious will just take their interpretation of design, their interpretation of order, and insist they know who did the creating because they have a pre-existing belief on the subject. That doesn't make the presumption true. In order for God creating the universe to be rationally true, you need to prove, with evidence, that God actually exists and that God was actually responsible. And they make no attempt whatsoever to do either. It's just an assumption based on emotional desire. And that doesn't prove a thing.
You see, that's as simple as it is for us to necessitate a who. You notice my son didn't say what made this, or what kind of a hurricane must it have taken, or what kind of a tornado. My son jumped immediately to who. So you're at a cabin in the woods, right? All by yourself. Your friends never showed up when they were supposed to. It's a dark and spooky night. You're eating alphabet cereal. You accidentally spill the box. You go to clean it up, and when you come back to bring the vacuum, it says, I wouldn't go to bed if I were you, spelled out in alphabet cereal. Would any of us go, there's a chance that the box spilled over that way?
There is. However, there's a better chance that someone came along and arranged the cereal that way. Language is inherently part of the human experience. We made it up, and it rests on our interpretation to realize what it means. However, you can go out into nature and find all kinds of examples of things that our brains interpret as letters that aren't designed at all. Our brains inherently look for patterns and find them whether they exist or not. This is exactly what the religious are doing. They have a pre-existing belief in a creative entity, thus they are looking for and finding patterns in nature that are interpreted as evidence for this creative entity. Because that's what they want to find, because they want it to exist. They insist that God did it. Well, how do they know that? They don't. It's why we stick with what we know is true, what we can demonstrate is true, before we go running off through the woods looking for things that we might like to be true. Because what we like doesn't matter.
Not reasonably. We would all freak out. I would call the police and run, and there'd be a lot of other things involved in that process. Why? Because when we see something as simple as that, we automatically jump to who?
Because in that specific instance, who is a better alternative? But they are then taking that claim and they're just running with it right into an intellectual brick wall. This is an assumption that is not rational to make. Just because something is true in one set of specific circumstances, that does not mean it is true in every conceivable set of circumstances. And that's really what they're saying. Someone made X, therefore someone made everything. And it doesn't work that way.
Now, there's actually a guy named Francis Collins. He mapped out the human genome. And the human genome is basically, think about the Encyclopedia Britannica. And in one simple strand of DNA, you can fill about 30 million volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica in just the human body.
Yes, so what? You also have to remember that Francis Collins became a Christian when he saw a waterfall in the woods frozen in 3 parts. So I wouldn't exactly count his religious sensibilities as terribly impressive. But we do understand how DNA came about naturally. It's a product of evolution, not magical men in the sky. It's a process of trial and error over many, many, many millions of years, and we have the evidence to back it up, whereas the religious only have feelings and wishful thinking. They are not operating rationally. They just want it to be true.
But if you grabbed a bunch of letters and a bunch of paper and a bunch of binding, you threw them in a room, no matter how much time you gave them, no matter how much no matter how many times you shocked them with whatever chemicals you would never get even a coherent sentence.
Because you're an idiot. You don't understand how evolution works, and that's hardly a surprise. This is just an appeal to ignorance, which is what most of his viewers are. Ignorant. The rest of us are just rolling our eyes. Biological evolution doesn't work that way. Nobody in their right mind thinks it does. But nobody in their right mind believes in gods either. So that tells you quite a bit. Even Francis Collins would tell this guy that he's a moron. This is not reality. It's why these people are so laughably absurd.
Nevertheless, the Encyclopedia Britannica, and in your cells and in your genome is a set of letters, ATs, Gs, and Cs that are the absolute copycat directions to make more of your personal cells.
Except they're not. Those aren't letters. They are amino acids. They are chemical compounds that operate based on physics and chemistry, not intelligence. We only label them with letters because they describe the specific amino acids in practice. We do it as a shorthand for our own understanding. I bet he doesn't even know that. Dude, that animation from Jurassic Park? That wasn't accurate science. Sorry to burst your bubble.
And so the same argument would be if something as simple as don't go to bed tonight or C plus L equals love on that tree at Hume Lake, if we look at all that and say that must be a who, and then you look at the complexity of the DNA sequence or the complexity of subatomic particles or microorganisms, when you look at those things that have coding and lettering inside of them as well, more complex than any computer could ever have. There's more neurological connections electrically moving in your brain than the whole county of Los Angeles combined.
Whoopee. This is just a Christian desperately looking for a place to insert his imaginary friend. They want it to be true, so they go hunting for places to shove this magical father figure in the sky into, and then proclaim that they've somehow proven something. And they've done nothing of the sort. Even if they were to prove that the universe needed an intelligent creator, and they've gotten absolutely nowhere remotely close to that, they still haven't proven that it was their intelligent creator. It could have been Bobo the tree god for all they can prove, but they're not interested in proving anything, if you notice. They are only trying to comfort the already religious into thinking that their religious beliefs are somehow valid. And they do it by just making empty claims and appealing to emotion. What else can they do?
And then to look at all that and say, no, I'm going to look for a natural explanation for this outside of intelligence, outside of a divine being. It seems to me that there's got to be a bias ahead of time, and I think a lot of people would agree with that.
Except you're wrong. The only answers that are acceptable, or should be acceptable, are those that are demonstrable. Even if they could prove that some vague deity of some description was responsible, that doesn't mean that their God done it. And as I said before, you not only have to prove that it happened the way that you describe, but you have to prove that your suggested solution is the actual solution to your claims. And you can't do either. You don't even try. It's why the religious work in vagaries. They are hoping that their followers will mentally fill in the blanks with their favorite delusion and applaud. And hand over their money, of course. You can't forget the money. This isn't about producing demonstrable, objectively verifiable evidence to show that you have any clue what the hell that you're talking about. Because, as should be no surprise to anyone with a brain, they don't.
Einstein even said this. He said, everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced at some point that some kind of a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe.
That was in a letter written in 1936 to a 6th grade student named Phyllis Wright. It was also originally written in his native German, and there is some difficulty translating it into English properly. A more correct translation to the passage is this. But also, everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that some sort of spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe, one that is vastly superior to that of man. In this way, the pursuit of science leads to a religious feeling of a special sort, which is surely quite different from the religiosity of someone more naive. Remember that last part, it comes up in a second. The quote that Chris read was, of course, ripped entirely out of context from the rest of the letter. Einstein stated quite clearly that, quote, therefore, a research scientist will hardly be inclined to believe that events could be influenced by a prayer, that is, by a wish addressed to a supernatural being. Context matters, except to the dishonest.
In this way, the pursuit of science leads to a religious feeling of a special sort.
You notice that he specifically skipped the part about naive theists, right? Flat out dishonesty. It's what North Coast Church breeds.
There's another guy. He's a Harvard evolutionary geneticist. His name is Richard Lewontin. And he says, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. He's going to help explain, well, if this is so obvious, why don't we just accept it in science? He says, because we have to take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill all the things that it's promised, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated, that means unproven, just so stories, because we've made a commitment ahead of time, a commitment to materialism. So he says, here's the reason that we can't have a supernatural explanation, because we decided in science, there's no room for it.
Yet Lewontin is an atheist. Go figure. This isn't someone suggesting that the supernatural is a remote possibility, because he doesn't. This is yet another quote taken completely out of context, as though that's any surprise. This originally came from an article published in 1997 in the New York Review called Billions and Billions of Demons. It was about a debate featuring Lewontin and Carl Sagan given before a room full of creationists in 1964 in Little Rock, Arkansas. Go read the article. It's available online. It's not that hard to find. It's actually an evaluation of the differences between Sagan's views on naturalism and evolution and Lewontin's own. It does not, in any way, shape, or form, attempt to suggest that there is a deity of any kind. More dishonesty. What else is new?
We didn't actually do all of the homework it takes to arrive at that. We decided before we ever opened our textbook, there is no God. Then, of course, when you dig up fossils and you look at the genome and you look at these numbers and letters and sequences and design, of course you're not going to find it. You have canceled it out a priori.
And that's not true. We have seen no evidence of any kind for the supernatural. In fact, the religious side can't even describe what the supernatural actually is, nor offer any demonstrable examples of it. It's just something that they've made up in their heads because it makes them feel good to think that it's there, even though you can't prove it. And that's the problem right there. Science deals with things that can be proven to be real in the real world. And the religious gods can't be. You simply claim it for emotional reasons, but you sure can't demonstrate it. That's why rational people don't take your empty claims seriously. No one should, but you're desperate to insist that it must be there because, fifis. And that's childish. It really is.
A priori means before I even started looking at it, I already decided my conclusion.
Which is exactly what you're doing. You've already decided that God is real because that's what you want to be true. And that's not how science works, which is why the religious largely ignore science. It gets in the way of their feelings. Science relies on observations. Religion relies on faith. That's why there are so many different religions out there. Anyone can make up anything and believe that it's true. But there's only one scientific method. You can't handle dealing with reality, so you reject rational and intellectual thinking. This isn't something that you ought to be proud of. Not one bit.
I think when you don't, God's voice screams all over the complexity of nature. And if it's that simple for us to beg for a who, you are so much more complicated than that. And that's the third evidence for God's existence.
And that's the third failure. Because that's really what these things are. Failures. You are taking things on faith that are not warranted intellectually. You are being patently dishonest by reading things out of context. You're coming to conclusions based on a priori faith, and then you pretend that that's what everybody else is doing instead. You are either patently ignorant of pretty much everything, or you're just lying through your teeth, and I honestly don't know which. I'm really starting to suspect the latter, though, especially in light of that very specific and very obvious edit of Einstein's letter. He just stops when it becomes too uncomfortable to continue. But this is religion we're talking about, where this is the status quo. When in doubt, lie, make something up, play make-believe, rely on feelings over facts, and then pretend the facts actually support you, even when they demonstrably don't. Because these people are idiots. They really, really are. So, I wanted to ask you what you think. There are 2 more videos in this series, but if he's 0 for 3 as badly as he is so far, is it really worth finishing it out? Are we going to get anywhere useful, and is he actually going to provide any demonstrable and objectively verifiable evidence for the existence of his God? Or is it just going to be more of the same? Let me know in the comments what you think. So, until next time, make sure you research what these fools say. It's really not that hard to debunk. They're almost always wrong and almost always lying to you. Go check it out for yourself. It'll really open your eyes.
Boom, 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 boom.